December 6, 1941, North Pacific Ocean. The carrier Akagi moves through heavy seas, black water, cold air, and the low hum of engines. Below deck, Lieutenant Zenji Abe sits by a dim light, a folded letter in his hand. Inside, a few lines for his wife and a lock of hair. He will fly tomorrow. He may not return. The ship trembles, the men whisper, and far across the ocean, a sleeping harbor waits in the sun. This is the last quiet night before the world changes. The sea had no color that night, only the gray of iron and distance. The Japanese strike force, 6 carriers strong, pushed east through the fog. Above the horizon, clouds hung low, heavy as stone. Each wave that struck the hull sounded like a heartbeat, slow, steady, human. Below deck, the air smelled of oil, rice, and salt. Pilots polished goggles. Mechanics checked torpedoes for leaks. No one spoke of what awaited them. They had trained for months in Kagoshima Bay, flight after flight, endless drills. Torpedo runs skimming over the water, dive angles memorized until muscle and machine became one. The instructor said it was about precision, but now, aboard the Akagi, it felt more like fate. 4 years earlier, Japan had been a nation burning with ambition. In 1937, the war in China began, a conflict meant to be quick, decisive. It became a quagmire of blood and cities in ruins. Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan, names that filled newspapers, but also graves. Japan's leaders promised an empire of prosperity, but the empire bled itself dry. The army demanded more oil, more steel, more land. The United States answered with embargoes, cutting off the fuel that kept Japan's machines alive. By 1941, the nation had reserves for barely 2 years. Without oil, the Navy would die where it floated. In Tokyo, diplomats argued for negotiation. Admirals argued for war. And in the middle of it all stood one man, Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto had studied in America. He had seen its factories, its schools, its rivers of industry. He once said, "If I am told to fight, I will run wild for 6 months. After that, I can guarantee nothing." He knew what awakening the United States would mean. Not a short war, but a tide Japan could not resist. Still, he obeyed. His plan was daring, precise, and almost impossible. Sail undetected across the North Pacific, strike the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, destroy it in one blow, shock the world before it could respond. The plan was called Operation Z, and tonight, that plan was only hours away from reality. On the Akagi, Lieutenant Abe wrote quietly in his logbook. He could hear the storm outside, the groan of steel as the ship leaned into the wind. He thought of Kagoshima, of the orange trees, the narrow streets, the scent of rain. He wondered if his wife was awake. He had sent her home to her parents, knowing he might never see her again. The men around him moved like shadows. Some prayed, fingers brushing the small Shinto charms tied to their belts. Others sat staring into nothing, lost in thought. They were not samurai, not heroes, just men doing what their country demanded. Abe's hands trembled as he folded the letter. Inside it, he had written one final line. "If the sea takes me, know that I flew with honor, not hatred." Above deck, officers gathered under red light. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood by the chart table, his face expressionless. He was a sailor, not a pilot, and even now he doubted the mission. He had questioned Yamamoto's plan, the risks, the distance, the lack of a formal declaration of war, but the orders were clear. There was no turning back. At 1800 hours, a coded message arrived from Tokyo. Nitaka Yamanobori, 1208. Climb Mount Nitaka. It meant one thing. The attack was approved. December 8th, Tokyo time. December 7th in Hawaii. The bridge fell silent. Nagumo nodded once. Around him, officers bowed slightly, their eyes dark with understanding. History had begun its count. Far below, the mechanics continued their work. Engines were fueled, bomb racks secured, propellers spun for testing. The sound was a steady pulse, metal and purpose. Every aircraft, from torpedo bomber to Zero fighter, was tuned to perfection. Each drop of oil, each bolt tightened, was an act of faith. Faith in the mission, in the emperor, in the idea that Japan's survival justified everything. But faith, like steel, bends under pressure. On the mess deck, someone played a harmonica. A faint tune quickly drowned by the ship's motion. The men listened for a while. Then, one by one, they rose and left, each carrying his own silence. In a corner, a young pilot closed his eyes and whispered a name, his wife's, his unborn child's. Another checked his pistol, though he would never fire it. Abe lay in his bunk, eyes open to the dark ceiling. He could hear the ocean through the hull, endless, ancient, indifferent. He thought of what they were about to do, not as strategy, but as reality. He wondered how many men were sleeping, unaware that the next sunrise would be their last. At 2300, the Akagi's engine slowed. The fleet reached its final position, 230 miles north of Oahu. Above, the stars flickered through breaking clouds. The wind had calmed. Only the faint crackle of the wireless carried through the night. In the command room, the clock ticked softly. No speeches, no cheers, just men waiting for morning. On the bridge, Nagumo stared at the sea. His reflection trembled in the glass. He thought of the American sailors who would soon wake to the sound of bombs. He thought of Yamamoto, far away, waiting for news he already feared. He whispered something no one else could hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a warning. And so the night stretched on, long, cold, endless. The ships sailed in silence. The planes stood ready, and beneath the noise of engines, beneath the steel and duty, every man felt the same pulse of doubt. The horizon ahead was dark, but in that darkness the future was already burning. Closing line. On the eve of destruction, the Pacific was quiet, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath, waiting for dawn to decide what kind of world would rise from its depths. December 7th, 1941, North Pacific Ocean. At 5 a.m., a gray dawn creeps over the waves. Frost clings to the rails of the carrier Akagi. The sea is calm, the sky clean, the air sharp enough to taste. On every deck, engines begin to turn, slow, steady, rising in pitch. The men are awake now. The waiting is over. In the next 2 hours, they will change the course of the century. The morning light came softly, almost kind. A faint glow spread across the horizon, painting the cloud edges in pale gold. For a moment, it looked like peace. Then the loudspeakers crackled. Orders echoed through steel corridors. Every man moved as if pulled by the same unseen hand. In the ready rooms, pilots zipped their flight suits, checked maps, tightened gloves. Mechanics rolled bombs toward the elevators, torpedoes gleaming with frost, armor-piercing shells marked in red chalk. The decks thudded with boots and machinery, a rhythm that sounded less like movement and more like destiny taking form. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, silent. To his left, the horizon, wide, endless, indifferent. To his right, the flight deck, a strip of steel where men's lives would soon vanish into air. He looked at his watch. 5:30 a.m. He had led fleets before, fought in wars before, but never a mission like this. Around him, officers spoke quietly, repeating final checks. Fuel levels, weather, radio silence. Wind from the northeast, a navigator murmured. Good for launch, Nagumo nodded. His jaw tightened, his hand resting on the railing until his knuckles whitened. The decision had already been made in Tokyo, but it was here, on this cold bridge, that it became real. On the lower deck, Lieutenant Zenji Abe fastened the strap beneath his chin. He looked around at the faces of his comrades, young, pale, focused. No one smiled. The only sound was the cough of engines warming. Ground crew pulled chocks from the wheels, their breath visible in the cold air. Oil fumes mixed with sea mist. A smell that would, for many of them, be the last they ever breathed. Each aircraft bore the rising sun insignia, red circles against pale wings. In the soft light, they looked almost fragile, like paper ready to burn. Far below, engineers checked the catapult gear, though the planes would take off under their own power. They wiped grease from their hands, leaned close to listen to the rhythm of the engines, a sound that told them everything. Too high, and the pistons would seize. Too low, and the planes would die before clearing the deck. Each adjustment was life or death, measured in vibrations. They did not see themselves as warriors. They were craftsmen, tuning instruments that would play the first notes of a global war. At 6 a.m., the carriers turned into the wind. The decks were cleared. Crewmen crouched at their stations, signal flags ready. In the ready room, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida gave the final briefing. He spoke plainly. Target, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. Objective, cripple the American Pacific Fleet. Timing, attack begins at 7:55 local time. No speeches, no ceremony, just facts. and the understanding that none of them could take the words back once the planes left the deck. Fuchida checked his watch. His heartbeat kept the same rhythm. 6:10 a.m. The first Zero fighter was moved into position. The deck officer raised 2 signal paddles. Engines roared, propellers blurred, and the first plane leapt forward, wheels lifting into the cold air. One after another, the aircraft followed, climbing through the thin dawn mist until the sky was filled with them, silver wings glinting against gray cloud. The noise rolled across the fleet like thunder. Men covered their ears, eyes tracking the rising formation until it became a pattern of small dark specks moving southeast toward the unseen islands below the horizon. Aboard the carriers, the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. The second wave of planes waited below deck, engines idling, exhaust fumes thick in the corridors. Pilots sat inside cockpits, watching condensation bead on the glass. Some mouthed quiet prayers, others simply stared ahead, expressionless, locked inside their training. No one cheered, no one called out. Even victory in that moment felt like a distant thing. Above them, the carrier decks were streaked with fuel and frost. Crewmen wiped them clean, preparing for the next launch. Every movement was measured, precise, almost ritual. As the last plane of the first wave disappeared into cloud, Nagumo turned to his staff. The officer beside him exhaled, a cloud of breath fading into the morning air. The admiral gave a single nod. "It has begun," someone said quietly. No one answered. The fleet continued east, engines humming below decks, propellers cutting through water the color of gunmetal. For the men who remained aboard, the waiting returned, heavier now, filled with what they could no longer control. They imagined the planes crossing the Pacific sky, line after line, the world still asleep beneath them. Hours stretched thin. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Fuchida led the first formation, 183 aircraft in 3 groups. From his cockpit, he could see the curve of the earth, the faint outline of Oahu far ahead. Below him, clouds rolled like waves of their own. He adjusted the compass, checked his watch again. Still too early. He tightened his gloves. In the radio silence, the only sound was the engine's steady growl, a heartbeat of metal. No one spoke, yet each pilot carried the same thought. The world before this flight and the world after it would not be the same. Back aboard the fleet, Nagumo remained on the bridge, eyes fixed on the horizon. He said nothing. The officers around him whispered, uncertain whether to speak. One of them offered tea. It went cold before he touched it. At 7:40 a.m., the carrier radios came alive, short bursts of static. Then a single word repeated 3 times. Tora! 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 Tiger, success, surprise achieved. Nagumo's head bowed slightly. He did not smile. The Pacific sun rose higher, burning the mist away. The decks glistened with dew, the waves turned blue. But to the men aboard the fleet, the day already felt darker. The silence that followed the message was not peace. It was the sound of history beginning to right itself in fire, in smoke, in lives that could never be returned. Closing line. At the breaking point of dawn, 6 carriers watched their shadows stretch across the sea. In that light, the world tilted and never found its balance again. 7:48 a.m., December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. The morning is clear. The flag rises above the ships, sunlight glinting on still water. Then, from the north, a sound begins, faint at first, like distant bees. Engines, many engines. Within seconds, the sky tears open. The first torpedo bomber drops to wave height. The war Japan hoped to win quickly has begun in fire. The first aircraft broke through the thin cloud cover and saw the harbor laid out beneath them. Battleships moored in neat rows, aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip, crews still at breakfast. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida looked down from his cockpit and saw the targets exactly as the reconnaissance photos had shown. He raised a small signal flag inside the cabin and tilted his wings. Below him, the harbor shimmered unaware. He pulled the flare gun and fired. One red, then another. Attack. The formation fanned out. Torpedo bombers dropped to less than 50 feet, their propeller tips slicing sea spray. They lined up for Battleship Row, the Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Arizona. On the water, sailors turned at the sound. a rising, pulsing roar. Some thought it was a drill. Others, a formation of American planes returning from patrol. Then the first torpedo struck. A column of water and steel erupted beside the Oklahoma. The concussion flattened men on deck, tore railings from the hull, and sent a shock through the entire harbor. Within seconds, the air was filled with the shriek of sirens, some mechanical, some human. The Japanese pilots moved with mechanical precision. Each had rehearsed this moment for months, memorizing the approach angles, the altitude, the release speed. But nothing in training matched the real side of explosions blooming across the harbor. Lieutenant Abbey guided his plane into the attack corridor. The sunlight flashed on the water, dazzling, almost beautiful. He released his torpedo at 1,000 meters, pulled sharply upward, and felt the aircraft shudder as it climbed. Behind him, the weapon sliced cleanly through the sea toward the dark hull of the West Virginia. Seconds later, the impact came, a muffled thunder that rolled through his bones. Below, the battleship lifted from the surface as if struck by an unseen hand. Fuel lines ruptured. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Smoke began to coil into the sky. Dive bombers followed next. They came from the sun, dropping at angles so steep their bodies pressed into the seatbelts. Bomb sights aligned, levers released, wings screamed. Each aircraft left a thin white trail through the air, a signature of gravity and intent. The Arizona took a direct hit at 8:06 a.m. The bomb pierced the deck near the forward magazine. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a flash. Then a roar that seemed to split the world. The explosion vaporized the bow and lifted the entire ship from the water. A fireball hundreds of feet high swallowed the mast. Pieces of steel rained down across the harbor, glowing orange in the morning light. From above, even the Japanese pilots flinched. The shockwave reached them, shaking wings and hearts alike. One pilot wrote later, "The ship vanished. It was like watching the sea erupt." On the ground, chaos consumed everything. Men ran barefoot across burning decks. Some leapt into oil-slicked water that caught fire as it spread. Others fought blindly to free trapped comrades below. Machine guns opened from the ships, tracing arcs into the sky. Too late, too few. The Nevada managed to get steam up, its propellers churning. She began to move down the channel, her band still playing on deck to keep rhythm for the gun crews. When bombers spotted her wake, they dived at once. Hits staggered the ship. She grounded herself to avoid blocking the harbor. Even wounded, she refused to sink where she stood. Across the base, airfields turned to inferno. At Wheeler and Hickam, rows of American planes burned before they could rise. Hangars collapsed in on themselves, glass melting in the heat. Pilots and mechanics fired rifles at passing silhouettes, their bullets vanishing into sky. The first anti-aircraft bursts finally reached altitude, small black flowers against the blue. Fuchida circled once, taking in the panorama. The harbor was an open furnace, columns of flame rising from each ship. He keyed the transmitter and sent the coded signal, "Tora, Tora, Tora." Surprise was total. The mission, by its cold measure, was a success. Yet even amid triumph, something heavy settled over the formation. They had trained to hit steel, not people. Now the sky below them boiled with fire and smoke, and the shapes moving on the decks were unmistakably human. Abe steadied his plane for the return north. He looked once more at the harbor, a place he would never see again. He saw lifeboats scattered among burning oil and a single American flag still flying through the smoke. It struck him that the battle looked less like victory and more like the end of something sacred. Back aboard the carriers, officers crowded around the radios. Reports came in through static. Oklahoma capsized. Arizona destroyed. Airfields burning. Resistance minimal, some men cheered. Others simply stared at the charts. Nagumo listened without expression. He knew what the planners in Tokyo would see in these numbers: a perfect strike, a textbook operation. But in his mind, he saw the waves closing over the harbor and heard Yamamoto's warning echo, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." He ordered the fleet to prepare for the second wave. By 9:30 a.m., the sky above Oahu was a maze of smoke trails. The second assault came fast, bombers striking the remaining ships, Zeros strafing anything that moved. One group hit the dry docks, another the fuel tanks. The smell of burning oil spread for miles, clinging to the wind like memory. Below, American sailors fought to the last hose, the last shell, the last breath. They dragged the wounded from the water, bandaged burns with whatever cloth remained, and kept firing. Their courage, born from chaos, would soon define an entire generation. At 10 a.m., the Japanese planes turned homeward. Over the ocean, the sunlight reflected off wings streaked with smoke residue. Some pilots smiled in relief. Others remained silent, eyes fixed on the horizon. They had completed their mission, but none of them yet knew the weight of what they had set in motion. Behind them, Pearl Harbor burned. 8 battleships crippled or destroyed, hundreds of planes lost, more than 2,000 dead. The Pacific was no longer silent. The world had changed in 90 minutes. Closing line. When the smoke finally lifted over Hawaii, the ocean was calm again. But beneath that calm lay the beginning of a storm that would sweep across half the planet. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. The sky, once blue, is now a sheet of black smoke. Ships lie broken in the water. Steel turned to graves. The air is thick with oil and fire and the sound of men calling for help. The attack has ended, but for those who lived through it, the day has only begun. The explosions had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. A silence broken only by the crackle of flames and the lapping of waves against twisted hulls. Men stumbled through the smoke, ears ringing, eyes stinging. Some still carried rifles, though there was no enemy left to shoot at. Others carried bodies. Seaman second class, George Brown waded through knee-deep oil, calling names he couldn't hear himself say. He had been on the Arizona's stern when the bomb hit. Now the forward half of the ship was gone, just water and fire. He kept walking anyway, through the heat, through the wreckage, because that's what you did when orders no longer mattered. At the Oklahoma, the sea was swallowing the hull. The ship had rolled completely over, its great guns pointing uselessly toward the bottom. From inside, faint hammering began, desperate, rhythmic. Men still trapped below. Rescue crews scrambled over the upturned hull. They tapped back with wrenches, trying to locate survivors in the maze of compartments. Every few minutes, a voice could be heard, muffled by steel. "We're here. We're here." They worked without pause. For some, they were too late. But by midnight, they had cut through to 32 men who lived because others refused to stop listening. Across the harbor, medics turned the mess halls into field hospitals. The floors were slick with seawater, blood, and oil. Nurses from nearby civilian clinics arrived still in their Sunday dresses, sleeves rolled up, eyes hollow but steady. Lieutenant Annie Fox, the first American nurse to earn the Purple Heart, moved between the wounded with calm precision. She had served in Hawaii for years. That morning, she treated burns, shrapnel wounds, and broken bodies. Many without morphine, many without time. Someone asked her how she stayed composed. She didn't answer. She just kept working. In the harbor's command center, Admiral Husband Kimmel stood before a shattered window, still in his white uniform. He had watched the first wave descend, powerless. The radio lines were jammed, the anti-aircraft crews unprepared, the radar warnings misunderstood. Every decision came too late. By afternoon, reports arrived from across Oahu, 18 ships damaged or destroyed. Over 180 aircraft lost, more than 2,000 men dead. Kimmel said little. He simply removed his cap, looked toward the burning harbor, and whispered, "I never thought it would happen this way." Outside, sailors were still dragging the wounded from the water. On the Nevada, fires raged through the decks. The crew fought for hours, even as ammunition cooked off around them. Fire hoses melted in their hands, boots stuck to the hot steel. When the order came to abandon ship, many refused. They stayed to flood compartments, to save the wounded, to keep her afloat. They succeeded. By sunset, she lay grounded but alive, a symbol already of defiance. Civilians across Oahu gathered on the hills, staring in disbelief. The entire sky over Pearl shimmered with black smoke that reached 20,000 feet. Children cried. Old men wept quietly, remembering other wars. No one knew if the Japanese fleet would come again. Fighter patrols were scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns manned through the night. Every sound of an engine sent hearts racing. At the Naval Hospital, Father Aloysius Schmidt moved among the injured. When water began flooding the compartment, he helped men climb through a small porthole to safety. When his turn came, he shook his head and said, "Let the others go first." He drowned there, the first American chaplain to die in World War II. They would name a ship for him later. But that night, he was just one more voice lost beneath the waves. Washington learned of the attack just before 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The coded messages were brief, clipped, impossible at first to believe. President Roosevelt sat silent for a long moment after hearing the words, "Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not drill." All across America, radios carried the breaking news. Factories stopped, churches filled. Mothers called sons. No one yet understood the scale, only that the world had changed. In the Pacific, the survivors already knew. They watched the sun go down behind columns of smoke, and they felt the weight of the day settle in their bones. Through the night, searchlights swept the harbor. The fires still burned, lighting the water in orange and red. Divers went below to look for trapped men. Many never came back up. The oil slicks burned for days, coating everything in a film of grief and fuel. In the mess hall of the surviving destroyer helm, a sailor sat with his head in his hands. He whispered over and over, "We didn't even see them coming." No one replied. At dawn on December 8th, the flag was raised again over the shattered harbor. It was torn and blackened at the edges, but still flew. Bugles sounded for the dead. The survivors stood at attention amid the wreckage, their faces streaked with smoke and tears. For a moment, even the wind stopped. The harbor was quiet now, but that quiet no longer meant peace. It meant promise of vengeance, of endurance, of an awakening nation. Closing line, Pearl Harbor had fallen, but from its ashes, something vast had begun to rise, a will that would cross oceans and change the fate of the world. December 8th, 1941. Dawn creeps over Pearl Harbor. Smoke still drifts from the water. Ships lie motionless, half submerged, like tombstones in the sea. The attack is over. The world is silent. But in that silence, the questions begin. The morning after the attack smelled of oil and salt and death. Everywhere the harbor steamed with the ghosts of fire. The sun, when it rose, was dull behind a haze that stretched for miles. Men worked in silence. They did not speak of what they had lost. They just kept working. Divers slipped beneath the surface, their helmets reflecting the orange light. They descended into the broken hulls, through narrow corridors filled with twisted steel and darkness. Their hands found bodies where they hoped to find survivors. In the stillness below, every movement felt sacred, every breath an act of remembrance. On shore, the hospitals overflowed. Makeshift cots lined the hallways. Nurses moved from one to the next, their faces pale, their uniforms streaked with blood and salt. The wounded spoke softly of friends they could not find, of ships that would not answer. Some held photographs, creased, waterlogged, the ink beginning to blur. Others stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open, hearing the sound of planes that were no longer there. Lieutenant Annie Fox worked through the night without rest. When asked later what she remembered, she said only this: the silence, the smell, and the hands of the men who wouldn't let go of mine. At Ford Island, sailors stood in lines to give blood. They came covered in soot and oil, uniforms torn, faces unreadable. No one complained. No one spoke of fear. They simply waited, sleeves rolled up, the world's grief in their eyes. One sailor wrote in his journal that night, "We are still alive." But the harbor is not. The sea itself feels wounded. Across the Pacific, the Japanese strike force steamed homeward. On the carrier Akagi, the air was cold, the deck windswept and quiet. No one cheered now. The men sat in small groups, talking in low voices, or said nothing at all. Commander Fuchida wrote in his log, "We have succeeded beyond expectation, yet the thought of that harbor haunts me. Victory feels hollow." Vice Admiral Nagumo walked the deck, hands clasped behind his back. He had refused to launch the third wave, the one meant to destroy the American fuel tanks and dry docks. His reasoning was sound. Risk too high, supplies lost, fuel running low. But as he looked toward the horizon, he felt a shadow cross his mind. the uneasy knowledge that something unfinished would one day return. In Tokyo, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, shouting, "Banzai!" Newspapers declared a triumph that would humble America. But in private, Admiral Yamamoto sat alone at his desk, his face drawn. He knew what others did not. The United States had not been crippled, only awakened. To a close friend, he murmured, "We can run wild for 6 months. After that, I can promise nothing." He signed the victory report with a heavy hand, then placed it face down. Outside, bells rang. Inside, the Admiral lit a cigarette and stared at the smoke. In Washington, Roosevelt prepared to speak to Congress. The room was silent as he began. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Each word fell like a hammer. By the time he finished, America was already changed. Men lined up at recruiting stations before the ink was dry on the declaration of war. The long night had become a call to arms. Back in Hawaii, the survivors listened to the broadcast from field radios. Some wept, some saluted. For them, the speech was not about vengeance. It was about meaning, about proving that what they endured would not end in ashes. As darkness fell again over Pearl Harbor, the fires were finally dying. Tugs moved slowly through the wreckage, their searchlights sweeping across the water. Divers' lamps flickered beneath the surface, brief glimmers in the black. A priest read prayers from the deck of a small boat, his voice carried by the wind. In the distance, someone began to play a harmonica, a faint, trembling sound that drifted over the harbor like smoke. No one knew the tune, but for a moment, even the ocean seemed to listen. The next morning, survivors returned to their ships. They raised flags over half-sunken decks, patched holes with scrap metal, and cleared debris with bare hands. They would not abandon what was left. Every piece of steel, every rivet, every tool mattered now. This harbor, once a place of peace, had become a forge. Engineers began planning the refits before the fires were out. Welders and machinists arrived from the mainland. The dry docks, though damaged, still stood. The same docks Nagumo had chosen not to destroy. Within months, those docks would repair the very ships he thought were lost and send them back to war. In the weeks that followed, funerals filled the days. Atop the water, small boats carried wreaths of flowers to the sites of the sunken ships. Families stood along the shore, waiting for names that would never come. The wind was soft that day, almost kind. It carried the scent of the sea and the faint clang of distant hammers rebuilding. At night, the harbor grew quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, one filled with purpose. The dead rested below. The living began to move forward. Closing line. The night after Pearl Harbor was long and merciless, but even in the darkness, the hands of the living kept building, because the world had given them no other choice. Spring 1942, the Pacific is no longer silent. The war that began in Hawaii now spans half the world, yet behind the headlines and the battles, another struggle unfolds, one of conscience and of memory. For the men who planned, fought, and survived Pearl Harbor, the reckoning has begun. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his quarters aboard the Yamato. The ship was new, fast, gleaming, unmatched. But the Admiral's eyes were tired. He held in his hand the latest intelligence report from Washington. American shipyards were already turning out new carriers at a pace Japan could never match. He had expected as much. When he ordered the attack, he knew it was only a matter of time before the industrial weight of the United States came crashing down. He told his officers quietly, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." The word spread through the fleet like rumor, half prophecy, half confession. In America, investigations began even before the smoke cleared. Committees demanded to know why radar warnings were ignored, why planes were left in rows, why the fleet had been caught unprepared. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the men in command that morning, were relieved of duty. They carried their shame in silence. Kimmel, once proud and upright, returned to his home in Arkansas. He refused to defend himself publicly, saying only, "I was responsible," and responsibility cannot be shared. For years, his name would carry the weight of a nation's anger. even as the truth proved more complex. Across the ocean, Japanese pilots were hailed as heroes. Yet not all of them felt victorious. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who had carried a farewell letter to his wife, never forgot the sight of the harbor in flames. In his diary, he wrote, "We trained for precision, but I did not imagine the sound. The sound stays with me." When the war turned against Japan, Abe would be stationed in the Philippines, then vanish without trace. One of thousands swallowed by the same storm he helped begin. Others survived but carried invisible scars. In interviews years later, many admitted that the morning of December 7th haunted them more than the years of defeat that followed. "It was beautiful," one said softly, "and that is what I cannot forgive myself for." At Pearl Harbor, divers continued recovery work for months. They brought up twisted guns, torn uniforms, pieces of ships that still held the scent of oil and death. In February 1942, they reached the last compartment of the Arizona. Inside, they found what they had expected: silence and stillness. The ship was sealed afterward, her crew declared entombed within. To this day, the Arizona lies where she fell, her decks rusting, her flag renewed each morning. For the men who returned to her, it was not a sight of defeat. It was a promise that the dead would not be forgotten, and that the cost of peace would always be remembered in the sound of water against steel. By mid-1942, the reckoning reached the battlefield. At Midway, the tide turned. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were lost in a single day. The same ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor now burned beneath the same sun. Pilots who had once dived upon Oahu now plunged into the Pacific, their training, their courage, their purpose consumed in fire. A Japanese survivor later said, "It was as if the gods themselves demanded balance." The sea took back what we had given. From that moment, Japan's advance faltered. The empire that had stretched from Manchuria to the Solomons began to contract, island by island, as the United States rebuilt, learned, and struck back. The reckoning was not only military, it was personal. Families in both nations received letters that said too little and arrived too late. Widows in Honolulu and Yokosuka alike sat beside empty chairs, wondering if the men they loved had believed in the same cause or merely obeyed it. In 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many survivors of Pearl Harbor felt no triumph, only exhaustion. One American sailor years later said in a documentary, "I didn't cheer when Japan surrendered. I just went quiet. We had all lost something too big to name." After the war, Yamamoto's fate was sealed. In 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his flight plan. His aircraft was ambushed and shot down over Bougainville. When they found his body, he was still sitting upright, hand on his sword, eyes closed. He had always believed he would die with his men. In that, he was right. In Washington, the news was met with grim satisfaction. But among American officers, there was also respect. Yamamoto had been both strategist and skeptic, the man who warned what war with America would mean, then carried it out anyway. His death felt less like victory, more like the closing of a circle. In the years that followed, testimony after testimony emerged. Japanese pilots, American sailors, intelligence officers, engineers. Each voice added a layer to the same memory, each from a different angle. Together they formed not a story of glory, but of consequence. A historian once wrote, "Pearl Harbor was not a mistake. It was the moment when all mistakes converged. The ambitions of empires, the limits of diplomacy, the blindness of pride, all meeting in 90 minutes of fire." By 1946, the war crimes tribunals began in Tokyo. Many of those who had planned the attack faced judgment, yet some who ordered it were already dead, and others still believed they had acted in service to their nation. The judges, too, struggled to define guilt in a war where the entire world had bled. In one quiet corner of the courtroom, a former pilot placed a photograph of his wife and child on the table before him. When asked if he felt remorse, he said, "I feel only that I am still alive, and that is punishment enough." For America, the reckoning took the form of memory. Pearl Harbor became more than a military loss, it became a vow. A reminder that vigilance once lost must never be lost again. Every year, survivors gathered at the harbor. standing in silence as the flag rose above the water where their friends still slept. Many would say they felt peace there. Others said they never truly left that morning behind. Closing line, war ends on paper, but reckoning begins in the hearts of those who remember. At Pearl Harbor, the tide of truth still rises and falls, carrying with it the echoes of all who were there. December 7th, 2021, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 80 years after the morning that changed the world, the sea is calm again. White memorials float where the ships once burned. Beneath the surface, the water still whispers through the bones of steel. The war is long over, yet it breathes here still in the quiet that follows every wave. The harbor looks different now. Palm trees sway where gunfire once echoed. Tourists walk the decks of the Missouri, taking photographs where surrender once ended a global storm. Yet every guide who speaks here lowers their voice without meaning to. It is a place that asks for respect. Below the surface, the Arizona still bleeds. Drops of oil rise slowly from her hull, one by one, like dark tears. Sailors call it the black tears of the Arizona. They have been rising for 80 years, a slow, endless memorial that needs no words. Every December, survivors return. They are few now, men in their late 90s, faces lined by time and salt. They stand at the rail, hats in hand, and stare down into the water. They do not speak of hatred. They speak of friends, names, faces, the smell of burning oil, the sound of hammers under steel. Memories no one else can carry for them. The world that Pearl Harbor created did not vanish with the war's end. It reshaped everything: industry, alliances, technology, even belief. Out of its ruins came the aircraft carrier era, the atomic age, the rise of the United States as a global power. For Japan, it led to reflection, reconstruction, and a generation that would dedicate itself to peace through creation, not conquest. Two nations once divided by fire became bound by memory and by warning. In the museums of Tokyo, Pearl Harbor is still taught, not as triumph, but as tragedy. In classrooms across America, the same lesson endures: vigilance, humility, and the cost of underestimation. Every year, veterans from both sides shake hands across the memorial decks. Their eyes, when they meet, hold something wordless: the understanding of men who have seen the full measure of war. In one photograph taken at the 70th anniversary, a Japanese pilot's son stands beside the daughter of a sailor killed on the Arizona. Their faces are still, the sea behind them wide and blue. No caption is needed. That image says what history books cannot: that grief does not belong to one nation alone. The technology of war born in that era still shapes the present. Radar, carrier aviation, mass production, and code breaking, all forged in those years of fear and urgency. Every modern fleet, every communication network carries in it the trace of lessons written in smoke over Oahu. And yet, for all our progress, the same fragility remains, the same moment between peace and disaster, the same illusion that we will always have time to prepare. At the USS Arizona Memorial, a wall of marble bears the names of 101 sailors and Marines. Most were never found. Visitors run their fingers across the carved letters, whispering them as if to keep them alive. The air inside is quiet, the light pale and reverent. Through the open windows, you can hear the water below, lapping gently, endlessly, against the past. A survivor once said, "When I come here, I feel like the boys are still standing watch. They never left, and neither have we." He died a few years later, his ashes scattered over the wreck where he once served. Many have followed, choosing to rest beside their shipmates in the harbor that became their home. For Japan, remembrance takes another shape. In Kagoshima Bay, where the pilots trained, the airfield is now quiet. Children play where Zero fighters once launched into practice dives. A small shrine stands nearby, white paper ribbons fluttering in the wind. On its plaque are the words, "May peace take flight." In that simplicity lies the true weight of the past. For the men who trained there, the mission was destiny. For those who live now, it is memory. The world has moved on, but not away. Every generation rediscovers the story. They watch the films, read the letters, listen to the voices. And in each retelling, they hear something new. Not the sound of bombs, but of consequence. Pearl Harbor is no longer just a day of infamy. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when courage and blindness share the same hour. The harbor today is filled with light. Fish swim through the skeletal beams. Coral grows along the rusted decks, turning wreckage into reef. Nature, slow and patient, has begun to heal what man destroyed. And yet, even in that beauty, there is solemnity, the reminder that peace too must be maintained. Every visitor who steps onto the memorial hears it in their heart. The hum of distant engines, the sound of sirens, the voices of men who never saw another sunrise. History does not whisper here, it breathes. In the archives of both nations, reels of film still sit in temperature-controlled vaults. Footage of the attack, letters, orders, the voices of the men themselves. Each time one is played, the war begins again, for just a moment, alive in sound and memory. It reminds us that history is not a story that ends. It is a story we inherit. Closing reflection: war changes everything. Nations, machines, men. But in the end, it leaves us with the same question that haunted both sides of Pearl Harbor. What do we build once the smoke clears? Weapons or understanding? Walls or bridges? Steel or remembrance? War doesn't vanish. It changes its shape and waits to be rediscovered.